Somewhere in a federal office right now, there is a case file that has never been closed. It's over 60 years old. The three men it names have not been seen, confirmed, or heard from since the night of June 11, 1962. And by law, the United States Marshals Service cannot close their file until each of those men would turn 100 years old. That deadline is almost here. The case is the only escape from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary that was never definitively solved. Not because no one tried to solve it, because nobody could ever prove whether Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin died in the freezing water of San Francisco Bay or actually made it out alive. Here's the real question. Alcatraz was built to be inescapable, so how did three inmates vanish from the most secure prison in America, and why 6 decades later does the FBI still refuse to call it solved? Start with the island itself. Alcatraz sits in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by water that stays around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold enough to cause hypothermia in under an hour. The currents around the island are notoriously violent, shifting direction with the tide, capable of dragging a swimmer miles off course or straight out to the open Pacific. In its 29 years as a federal prison, 14 men attempted to escape Alcatraz across multiple tries. Officially, none succeeded. Several drowned. Most were simply recaptured within hours, shivering and half frozen, pulled from the water or picked up on the rocks before they'd gotten anywhere close to the mainland. The prison's own reputation did half the guarding. Inmates were told repeatedly that no one survives the swim, that the bay itself was a better security system than any wall or guard tower. The island's reputation wasn't just talk. In May 1946, a failed escape attempt turned into what guards still call the Battle of Alcatraz. 6 inmates seized weapons from the guard armory, and over the 2 days that followed, the U.S. Marines were called in with grenades and rifle fire to retake the cell block. 2 guards and 3 inmates were killed. It remains one of the bloodiest prison uprisings in American history, and it cemented Alcatraz's reputation as a place nobody walked away from, a reputation that stood unchallenged for the next 16 years. Frank Morris didn't believe that. He had an IQ measured at 133, near genius level, and a criminal record that started at age 13. He'd escaped from a Louisiana prison before. When he arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, staff considered him one of the most dangerous men on the island, not because of violence, but because of how smart he was. He teamed up with Clarence and John Anglin, brothers who had grown up swimming for hours in the cold rivers of Michigan and Florida, comfortable in open water in a way almost no one else on the island was. As kids, the Anglins used to swim across the flooded quarry near their family's farm just for fun, in water cold enough that other children refused to go in. That childhood habit would end up mattering more than anything else in the plan. Together with a 4th inmate, Alan West, they spent months planning what the prison called impossible. The plan took more than a year to finish. It started with spoons. Using stolen spoons, sharpened tools, and a broken vacuum cleaner motor rigged into a makeshift drill, the men carved through the crumbling concrete around the ventilation grates at the back of their cells, working during music hour when the noise from the recreation yard covered the sound. Every night's work meant a pile of wet concrete dust that had to disappear before morning inspection, so they mixed it with mop water and rolled it into damp clay, which they quietly reshaped into homemade ashtrays. Each night they hid the growing holes behind cardboard grates painted to match the wall. If a guard had ever pressed a hand against one of those grates, the entire plan would have ended in solitary confinement, a risk all 4 men accepted, night after night, for over a year. Behind their cells was an unguarded utility corridor. Night after night, they slipped through their widened vents and climbed to a hidden workshop on the cell block roof, where they built what they'd need to survive the water: a raft and life vests stitched together from more than 50 stolen prison raincoats, sealed with heat from a stolen steam pipe. To fool the guards during nightly headcounts, they built dummy heads out of soap, toilet paper, and real human hair collected from the prison barber shop, painted with paint smuggled from the workshop. Placed under blankets in the dim light of a cell at night, they were convincing enough to pass inspection for hours. On the night of June 11, 1962, Morris and the 2 Anglin brothers made their move. Alan West, the 4th man, fell behind. His vent hole hadn't been widened enough, and by the time he broke through, the others were already gone. He would later become the only one of the 4 who was ever seen again, recaptured still inside the prison. When investigators interrogated him afterward, West gave them the only first-hand account of the plan anyone would ever get, confirming the raft, the raincoats, the timeline, everything except the one detail that mattered most: what happened to the other three once they hit the water. The other three climbed to the roof, descended a pipe on the outside of the building, crossed a fence, and inflated their raincoat raft at the edge of the island in the dark. Then they pushed out into 50-degree water, into currents strong enough to kill trained swimmers, with a system so simple it barely deserved the word plan, paddle, and hope. The next morning, guards found 3 empty beds and 3 convincingly lifelike dummy heads. By the time the alarm was raised, the men had a head start of at least several hours. What happened next triggered one of the largest manhunts in American history. The FBI and Coast Guard searched the bay for weeks, running boats and helicopters over the same cold water, checking every stretch of shoreline from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Marin Headlands. And they found things: a makeshift paddle, pieces of a deflated raincoat raft, a wallet wrapped in plastic containing photos and the names of relatives of the Anglin brothers, found floating near the island days later. A life vest was later recovered nearly 200 miles north, torn and empty. To investigators, that evidence pointed one direction: the men had drowned, and the bay had simply never given their bodies back. Officially, the FBI closed its active investigation in 1979, concluding that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers most likely died attempting the crossing. That same year, the story became famous far beyond San Francisco. The film Escape from Alcatraz, starring Clint Eastwood as Morris, turned the case into one of the most recognizable prison break stories in American pop culture, and cemented, in millions of people's minds, the version of the story where the men simply vanished into legend. But here's the twist that has kept this case alive for over 60 years. No bodies were ever found, not one. And a case built entirely on absence started collecting exactly the kind of ambiguous evidence that refuses to close a mystery. Family members of the Anglin brothers have long claimed the men survived. In 2015, apparent contact from the family surfaced: a photograph, reportedly taken in Brazil in 1975 and kept hidden by relatives for 40 years, allegedly showing 2 men who forensic facial analysis experts said closely resembled an aged Clarence and John Anglin. The family says they received Christmas cards for years afterward, unsigned, mailed from South America. Then in 2018, San Francisco police received a letter claiming to be from John Anglin himself, now in his 80s, offering to turn himself in for reduced medical care in exchange for guaranteed freedom. Handwriting analysis couldn't confirm or rule it out. Like almost every piece of evidence in this case, it raised more questions than it answered, and it meant that, as late as 2018, someone out there still wanted investigators to believe at least one of the 3 men was alive. In 2014, a team of Dutch researchers at Delft University ran detailed tidal and current simulations of San Francisco Bay for the exact night of the escape, modeling exactly how the water would have moved hour by hour. Their conclusions surprised a lot of people who'd assumed the case was settled. If the men entered the water within a narrow window around midnight, the tide would have been moving in almost exactly the right direction to carry a raft to Marin County's shoreline, not out to open ocean. Survival, they found, wasn't just possible. Under the right timing, it was plausible, which is exactly the timing witnesses estimated the men actually left. So the honest answer is that nobody actually knows. Not the FBI, who closed an active case they could never technically solve, but never marked it solved either. Not the historians and amateur investigators who have spent decades combing through the same handful of physical clues, hoping some new piece of evidence finally tips the balance. Not even the family, who believe but can't prove, and who have spent 60 years living with a version of grief that never gets to fully resolve, because there was never a body to bury or a confirmed death to mourn. Which brings us back to that federal case file, the one that's still technically open today, decades after everyone involved should have retired or died of old age regardless of what happened that night. Every year, well over 1 million tourists take the short ferry ride out to Alcatraz Island, walk through cell block B, and stand in front of the exact vent Frank Morris carved through, now covered in protective glass. Almost none of them know the case file back on the mainland is still, technically active, waiting on birthdays that are arriving right about now. Somewhere on a shelf in a government building, 3 names are still waiting for an ending nobody has ever been able to write. Maybe the water took them. Or maybe on one cold June night in 1962, Three men simply solved a problem everyone else had called impossible, disappeared into the dark, and never looked back.